The wind moves like a living thing tonight, dragging its long, icy fingers across the open plains, whispering through the grass that still pokes out of the snow like brittle bones. You can almost taste the cold, sharp, metallic, ancient, each breath slicing through your chest before turning to mist that fades into the silver horizon. Somewhere in that endless white silence, a thread of smoke climbs toward the low sky, bending and curling before it disappears, a quiet promise that there is warmth somewhere out there. You walk toward it without realizing why, boots crunching softly over snow that gives way in deep sighs beneath your weight. And as you move, a thought stirs at the back of your mind. How did they survive this? How did anyone sleep here in this merciless emptiness, without freezing before dawn? Long before the roar of trucks or the hum of power lines, these plains belonged to nations who understood the cold in a way few of us ever will. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, the Cree. Names that carried stories of endurance, families who could read the snow the way others read books. They knew how to turn the biting wind into a teacher, not an enemy. And in winter, when the rivers froze and the buffalo herds moved south, their villages transformed. The soft summer tip became thick, insulated fortresses of hide and sinew, drawn tight against the poles like stretched skin over bone. To the untrained eye they might have looked fragile, like simple tents fluttering against the storm, but each one was the result of generations of refinement, a perfect balance of form and survival. Inside, the air would have been tinted with the faint sweetness of smoke and cured hide. Firelight would tremble against the poles, painting soft amber stripes across faces wrapped in fur beneath the sleeping robes. Layers of buffalo hides trapped the heat like a living blanket, and every person inside became part of the warmth, every heartbeat feeding the small ecosystem that kept death at bay just beyond the thin hide walls. Some tribes stitched 2 or even 3 layers of hide together, the outermost treated with animal fat to repel snow and wind. When storms raged, a few even pressed a thin crust of clay or frozen mud along the outside, turning their tents into makeshift shells, a primitive insulation that hardened under frost. It sounds counterintuitive, adding wet material in the cold, but when that layer froze, it sealed the warmth in, transforming the tent into a breathing, living cocoon of survival. Step closer in your imagination, and you might see how the circle of tents stood together, never scattered or random. Each one faced slightly inward, forming a barrier that broke the wind and concentrated the warmth of the fires that burned inside. Snow itself became an ally. Drifts piled high against the lower edges of the hides, and instead of sweeping them away, many families left them there, using the enemy's own weapon to their advantage. The compacted snow acted as insulation, thickening the walls, muffling the howling plains until the wind outside was little more than a memory. It was not ignorance but wisdom, to understand that sometimes you survive not by fighting the storm, but by folding it into your shelter. Within these snowy fortresses, life continued as it always had. Mothers sang softly to their children, their voices rising and falling with the crackle of the fire. Elders told stories of the first hunters, of spirits that roamed the winter sky. Dogs curled tightly near the entrance, their breath forming little clouds in the cold air. Every sound was hushed, as though the entire camp had learned to move in harmony with the frozen earth. And though the temperature outside could fall to 40 below, inside it might be warm enough for bare hands to rest comfortably near the fire. There was no luxury, no margin for waste. Every movement mattered, even the placement of the fire pit at the center, the small opening at the top for smoke, the careful adjustment of flaps to control airflow, all of it refined by centuries of observation. Too little ventilation and the smoke would suffocate you. Too much and the heat would vanish. Balance was everything. If you could step into one of those tents tonight, you would notice how the air feels alive, not like the dry central heat of a modern house, but a breathing warmth that swells and ebbs with every flicker of flame. Shadows ripple along the curved walls, and outside, the wind moans against the hide like a ghost denied entry. You'd probably expect unbearable chill, Yet instead you'd find yourself lulled into that strange comfort only true exhaustion can bring. Perhaps that's the secret. They didn't chase perfect warmth. They learned to coexist with the cold, to endure it just enough to make peace with it. And if you listened carefully in the dark, you might hear the rhythm of the night, the low creak of hide shifting on poles, the muffled bark of a dog, the slow breathing of people who trusted the fire and the walls they built with their own hands. Every sound a reminder that survival was not a miracle here, but a practice, a ritual repeated each night until spring returned. Inside the tipi, the night becomes its own small universe. You can feel the subtle heartbeat of life pulsing through every layer of hide, every soft rustle of fur, every faint sigh of wind sneaking through the seams. The world beyond those walls no longer matters. Out there is hunger, frost, the endless moan of the plains, but here inside, time slows until even the fire seems to breathe in rhythm with the people gathered around it. The floor beneath your feet isn't bare snow or frozen earth. It's padded thick with buffalo hides and woven mats, each layer carefully arranged to trap heat from below, turning the ground itself into a cradle of warmth. The center of the tipi belongs to the fire, a living, flickering heart that never truly sleeps. Its smoke spirals upward in lazy curls, slipping through a small, deliberate opening at the top, a hole that breathes in sync with the weather. Too wide and the cold rushes in like a thief. Too narrow and the smoke gathers low, stinging eyes and throats. The women of the camp knew this delicate balance better than any engineer could explain it. They adjusted the smoke flaps with practiced precision, reading the wind not from instruments but from instinct, from how the air moved across their skin. Each ember glows with memory. The last warmth of a fallen tree, the final gift of summer stored deep within wood, now turned to light. Around that fire, families huddle close, sharing not only the heat but the comfort of presence. There's no wasted motion. Hands move in quiet coordination, one tending the fire, another stirring a small pot of broth, another laying down more furs for the children already dozing. The air smells faintly of fat and smoke, of cured hide and sweet grass, the scent of survival itself. And then there's the sound, the soft murmur of voices layered over the steady hiss of the flames. Someone hums an old tune, maybe an echo of a song learned from a grandmother long gone. A man tells a story of a winter even colder than this one, when the buffalo vanished and the people had to melt snow to drink. A child giggles at the part where the spirits in the storm play tricks on hunters, and everyone smiles because even in hardship laughter is warmth too. In the flickering glow their faces shine, not polished, not perfect, but alive, framed by fur and shadow, eyes glinting like embers. The walls of the tipi are more than shelter. They are a living archive of care. Each hide has been scraped, softened, smoked and stitched by hand, the seams sealed with sinew and grease. A tipi could be taken down and moved within an hour if the tribe needed to follow the herds. Yet when it stood, it felt as solid as a house. The poles, stripped and smoothed from young trees, rise in perfect symmetry, an architecture guided by the stars as much as by human hands. Some historians compare it to a cathedral of the plains, but that misses the intimacy of it. A cathedral prays upward, a tipi prays inward, toward the fire, toward the center, where life itself gathers and stays warm. Even in the deepest cold, when the snow pressed high against the outer walls and the wind screamed like an animal, the fire never went out. It burned day and night, small but steady, watched over by whoever could not sleep, a mother with an infant, an elder with old bones that ached in the cold, or a young boy chosen for his patience. Fire was a companion, not a tool. You didn't leave it alone because it was part of the family. When the last ember dimmed, someone whispered to it, coaxing it back to life, feeding it slivers of kindling as though feeding a heartbeat. Sometimes, when the nights stretched too long and too quiet, the people would perform small rituals to remind themselves that warmth came not only from flame but from spirit. A prayer said in rhythm with the crackle of the logs, a handful of herbs tossed into the fire to carry a wish into the smoke, the rising scent of sage, cedar, or sweet grass filling the air with a hush of peace. And outside, where the cold world waited in silence, the scent drifted upward, a signal to anyone still wondering that somewhere nearby, life was enduring. If you stayed still long enough, your body would begin to understand what theirs had learned generations before. That warmth isn't only about temperature, it's about trust. The trust that the fire will hold through the night, that the hides won't tear, that the wind won't find its way in. You'd pull the fur robe closer to your shoulders, feel its weight settle across your chest, and notice the way it traps not just heat, but calm. Sleep here wasn't the deep oblivion of comfort. It was a shared surrender, a quiet pact between human and nature. And when the fire finally burns down to its faintest embers, the last person awake would stir the ashes gently, then lie down beside the others, drawing the robe close, listening to the wind circling outside. There's a rhythm to it. The sigh of the storm, the occasional pop of a log, the steady, soft breathing of people who've learned that even the coldest night can be endured when warmth is built together. By the time the first light of dawn brushes the horizon, the fire inside the tipi has burned low, its glow reduced to a quiet constellation of coals that pulse beneath a thin film of ash. The cold creeps in again, curious, searching for gaps in the hide, testing the edges of sleep. But these people, the ones who made their homes from skin and bone and wind, never trusted a single source of warmth. They learned to weave heat into the very rhythm of life. Before nightfall, stones were placed near the fire, smooth river rocks carried from far-off streams in warmer seasons. As the flames licked their sides, the stones drank in the heat, holding it deep inside. Hours later, when the last light dimmed and even the bravest flames shrank to embers, someone would use a forked stick to roll those stones into a shallow pit lined with bark or hide. Blankets, robes, and bedding would be drawn over it, and the earth itself would seem to exhale warmth. It wasn't luxury, it was ingenuity carved out of necessity, a way to make the ground itself a quiet partner against the frost. The buffalo, too, remained present even long after its life had been taken. Its thick hide, cured and smoked until soft, was more than clothing or bedding. It was architecture. One hide might become the outer skin of a tipi, another, a sleeping robe thick enough to trap a family's breath beneath it until morning. The fur side always faced inward, keeping the heat in and the moisture out. In the worst storms, people layered them, 2, sometimes 3, sewing strips of sinew through the edges so that no draft could slip through. Some even lined the interior walls with an extra hide, creating a pocket of still air between layers, a primitive but effective insulation that modern engineers would later describe in their own language, thermal buffering. And then there was movement. They knew that stillness was the enemy of warmth. When a person sat too long by the fire, the body cooled. So before sleep, there was often motion, tending the fire, shaking out furs, stretching, checking on the dogs, making sure the children were tucked in. Warmth wasn't passive, it was earned, generated, shared. When you lay down, it wasn't alone. You slept close, side by side, the living heat of another body, as precious as any flame. Even the smallest infants were kept against the chest beneath layers of hide, where the mother's breath mingled with theirs. No energy wasted, no warmth lost to the dark. In some tribes, hot stones were wrapped in cloth and tucked near the feet. Under the robes, a small comfort, but one that could mean survival when the night turned cruel. Others used embers carried from the main fire, sealed carefully in hollowed-out horns or bowls of clay, still glowing when dawn came. These were more than survival tools. They were continuity, proof that the flame never truly died, even when carried across the frozen plains to a new camp. You might imagine that life inside these shelters was bleak, but there's something deeply human in the way necessity created tenderness. When the cold pressed hardest, people spoke more softly, moved closer, shared stories not to pass time but to stay awake just a little longer before the fire died down. Even the act of preparing to sleep became ritual, shaking out the robes, stacking the stones, smoothing the hides, tucking stray embers under new wood. It was choreography passed down from generation to generation, each movement a small prayer for another sunrise. Beyond the circle of tents, the snow stretches unbroken for miles, silver in the moonlight, blue in the dawn. Yet inside each tipi, warmth is an act of faith, the belief that clever hands, thick hides, and shared breath can hold back the entire weight of winter. And somehow they did. When the wind screamed, they listened. When the cold bit, they answered with fur, fire, and stone. Their mastery wasn't about dominating nature, but understanding its rhythm, learning that even the harshest season can be softened if you move in harmony with it. So when you imagine them asleep, wrapped in thick robes, faces glowing red from firelight, dogs curled close at their feet, remember that this wasn't just endurance, it was communion. The fire, the hides, the stones, the people, all breathing together under the same low sky. And outside, the wind moves on, searching for weakness, finding none. When the storms eased and the snow packed hard underfoot, there came a time when the people had to move. Sometimes it was the herds that led them, sometimes the hunger, sometimes just the rhythm of the season whispering that the old campsite had given all it could. Out on the open plain, travel in winter was never a choice made lightly. The world was raw and white and endless, the sun low and weak in the southern sky, the horizon blurred by wind-driven dusts of ice. Yet the same people who built warmth from hides and stone knew how to fold that warmth into motion, to carry the comfort of home with them wherever they went. The tipis could come down within an hour, poles unlashed, hides rolled tight and bound with leather cords, smoke-blackened poles strapped to travois, those simple wooden sled frames pulled by horses or, in earlier centuries, by dogs. The fire itself was never left behind. A small clay bowl or hollowed buffalo horn would cradle a bed of glowing embers, packed carefully with ash to slow their burn. Even as the camp disappeared into the snow, that ember still lived, tucked beneath hides on a travois, or held close by an elder. When they stopped again to build new shelters, those same coals would be stirred into flame, and the new village would rise around the same fire as before, the same heartbeat carried through the cold. The trails stretched across frozen rivers and wind-swept prairies where nothing moved but ghosts of breath. They wrapped themselves in thick robes, faces covered in fur, eyes narrowed against the glare of snow. The rhythm of the horses' hooves, the hiss of sled runners on ice, the occasional call between travelers, these were the sounds of migration. Even the children learned early that sound carried far in winter, so their voices stayed low, blending into the hush of the landscape. In this silence, every step was measured, every break in the wind a small grace. At night, they set up camp in the shelter of low ridges or riverbanks, where snowdrifts formed natural walls. Tipis rose again, their poles tilted toward the stars, hides drawn tight and lashed down with frozen ropes of sinew. Fires flickered back to life, and smoke drifted upward, visible for miles against the pale sky. Within hours the same circle reformed, families returning to their places, dogs circling for warmth, the same songs murmured over new ground. To an outsider it might have seemed repetitive, almost ritualistic, but for those who lived it, this was continuity, proof that life, like the fire, could be rebuilt wherever they chose to stop. Sometimes the wind turned savage midway through the journey, swallowing the trail and erasing every footprint. In those moments, survival became a choreography of instinct. The strongest rode ahead to break the path. The others followed in their wake, and when it grew too fierce to see, they tethered the horses nose to tail and moved as one long body through the whiteout. The hides they wore grew stiff with frost, hair glittering with ice crystals that caught the faint light of the moon. But no one panicked. They had known this before. They understood that to fight the storm was to lose. The only way through was patience, steady motion, trust. When they finally stopped again, their faces red with windburn. The fire came first. Always the fire. The ember was dug out from its bed of ash, coaxed back into flame, the smoke rising thin and blue against the dusk. Children gathered close, dogs pressed near, and little by little the camp breathed again. Food would come later, dried meat softened in hot broth, fat rendered into warmth. But for that first moment, it was enough just to see the fire alive again, enough to hear the crackle that meant they had survived one more crossing. By morning, the storm might have passed, leaving the world washed clean, silent, glittering beneath a pale sun. From a distance you could see the circle of tipis, their smoke curling straight upward into the still air, small, stubborn islands of life in an ocean of white. The people inside would be stirring, feeding the fire, wrapping their robes tight, preparing once more to move. To live this way was to live inside a rhythm that never ended, building, burning, sleeping, travelling, the seasons turning like a slow drumbeat beneath their feet. And through it all, the same ember, the same warmth, the same unbroken thread of survival. The first sign of spring was never the warmth itself. It was the sound, the soft dripping of meltwater somewhere just beyond the tents, the faint groan of ice breaking on the river, the whisper of wind no longer sharpened to a blade, but softened to a breath. One morning the air smelled different, less of smoke, more of earth. The dogs lifted their heads first, noses twitching toward the thaw. Then the children stirred, blinking at the light that no longer bit at their eyes. The world was still grey and thin, but the edge of winter had finally cracked. Inside the tipi, the fire burned lower now, not because it was neglected, but because it no longer had to fight so hard. Ash lay thick around the coals like snow around a seed. People moved more easily, shaking off the heaviness of furs that had wrapped them for months. There was a strange quiet in these mornings, not the silence of fear but of relief. The air that once threatened to steal their breath now felt like a gift. Outside, the snow sank in on itself, collapsing into small valleys and ridges that gleamed with meltwater. The buffalo would return soon. The herds always knew before humans did when the earth was ready again. Families began to unlash the hides, letting the wind pass through for the first time in moons. The smell of thawed ground, of wet grass and smoke mingling, drifted through the camp like a memory returning home. You could almost hear the land exhale. The elders would gather near the fire, their hands open to the heat, not for survival now, but for comfort. They spoke of the winter as one might speak of a teacher, strict, merciless, but never cruel without reason. Each hardship had been a lesson. Each night endured a story worth keeping. The children listened wide-eyed as they heard once more about the time the snow buried the tipis so deep the stars disappeared, or when a hunter followed frozen buffalo tracks for 2 days and came back carrying firewood instead of meat, calling it a greater victory. They learned that warmth was not something you possessed, but something you built, together, again and again, until the cold respected your patience. Some evenings, even as the air grew mild, families still lit the fire higher than needed, almost out of habit. The crackle of the flames was the pulse of memory. A log split and hissed. The sparks climbed the air like spirits rising to join the fading stars. The smoke drifted upward, and then flattened, as if reluctant to leave. And in that moment, the people remembered how the snow itself had once been their ally, how the hides had sung under the weight of wind, how the stones had held their heat through the darkest nights. The memory of cold made the warmth sweeter. Soon they would pack again, following the herds north, the hides rolled tight, the poles strapped to horses, the embers carefully saved as always. But for a few precious days they lingered. Children splashed in the half-frozen streams, their laughter echoing across the open plain. Women spread the hides to dry in the sun, the smoke stains catching the light like inked pages. Men mended the traveway, testing ropes and poles with quiet satisfaction. It was a kind of peace, not absence of hardship, but the harmony that comes from understanding it. At dusk, when the sky burned low and the wind turned cool again, a few elders looked to the horizon and said the same thing they said every year: "Remember the winter, for it will return." And the people nodded, because they knew that the cold was not an enemy to be defeated, but a cycle to be honored, that survival was not conquest but conversation. The tippy walls that had once held back death now fluttered lightly in the breeze, their scars dark against the soft light of spring. And when night finally came, no longer heavy with frost, the stars hung low and clear, as if the sky itself had moved closer to listen. Inside the last glowing tipis, the fire murmured its slow, familiar song, and the people drifted to sleep, wrapped not just in warmth, but in gratitude for the storm that had passed, for the smoke that had risen, and for the quiet truth they had always known, that the cold, no matter how cruel, had never truly beaten them. By the time the last drifts of snow melted into the rivers, the land had begun to wake in full. The plains turned from white to gold, a slow unfurling of life that seemed to stretch in every direction. Birds returned first, their cries breaking the long silence that had ruled for months. Then came the smell, soil, wet and strong, the kind that clings to your hands when you dig into it. It was the smell of promise, of a world that forgave without forgetting. The people moved through it with quiet reverence, because they knew the ground they walked on had once been their blanket, their shield, their test. Even as warmth returned, the lessons of winter never left them. Inside the tipis, the hides were softened again with fat and smoke, cleaned of frost, stretched to dry in the sun. Children helped scrub them with flat stones, laughing as they worked, unaware that this simple rhythm, scrape, rinse, stretch, tie, was part of a story older than memory. The hides bore marks from every storm, small scars where wind had torn or smoke had darkened the edges. Yet no one thought to replace them quickly. Those scars were proof of endurance, like wrinkles on a wise face. Women sat near the fire, sewing new garments from the hides of last season's hunt. The needles, carved from bone, slid through the leather with the slow rhythm of breath. Each stitch was tight, patient, deliberate. You could hear the soft wick of thread pulling through, over and over, blending with the murmur of wind that moved gently now through the camp. Men worked outside, reshaping poles, mending travois, sharpening tools dulled by the cold. A camp after winter wasn't just a home, it was a heartbeat, gathering strength again. At dusk, when the air cooled but no longer threatened, the people would gather around fires that burned not for survival but for companionship. Flames reflected in their eyes like small suns, each spark a fragment of the long nights they had overcome. Elders spoke less now, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence itself was sacred, a reminder that the earth speaks in its own time. They listened to the crackle of wood, the distant howl of a wolf far beyond the river, and the soft chorus of frogs returning to thawed marshes. Life had begun its cycle again, and the people met it with a kind of calm acceptance few of us remember anymore. Every morning mist rolled low over the plains, curling around the hooves of grazing horses, rising in threads that caught the first light of the sun. From a distance it looked as if the earth itself was breathing, exhaling the memory of winter, inhaling the warmth of spring. Within the camp, children ran barefoot for the first time in months, their laughter blending with the calls of cranes and meadowlarks. The old dogs slept in the sun, twitching at dreams of hunts long past, and the fires burned smaller now, tended by habit more than need, their smoke rising as a slow salute to the changing season. Yet even in the growing warmth, the people never forgot how quickly comfort can vanish. Each evening, before the sky turned dark, someone always checked the hides, the fire pit, the storage of wood. It was not fear, it was respect, because somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the next winter was already gathering its breath. As the seasons turned and the warmth settled into the land, the people never forgot to honor the one companion that had carried them through every night of frost. The fire. It was not a thing to be used, not a tool to be mastered, but a spirit alive in its own right. They called it by many names, sometimes the breath of the earth, sometimes the tongue of the sky, and believed that every flame carried a small echo of the sun, a piece of light entrusted to humankind, so they would never be lost in darkness. When a new fire was lit in a tipi, it was done with quiet care. The coals from the old camp were placed first in the centre pit, a small circle of earth lined with stones blackened by years of smoke. Then came the tinder, dry grass, bark, shavings from cedar or willow, a spark, a breath, and the flame would rise again, licking the air as if remembering what it had once been. There was no cheering, no applause, only silence, reverence, and the soft murmur of gratitude. For to light a fire was not creation, it was continuation. The same flame that had burned through the last storm now lived again, proof that life had never truly gone out. Elders often told the children that the fire had its own eyes and ears, that if you spoke to it, it listened, not with words, but with the sound of your breath. Many believed that every family's fire was tied to the stars above, and that when a person died, their spirit joined that celestial flame, flickering forever in the night sky. So when someone passed during the long winter, the family didn't cry loudly or let the fire die down. They fed it gently, letting the sparks climb upward, believing that one of them carried the soul home. At night, when the wind howled outside and the walls trembled, people whispered prayers into the flames. They asked not for wealth, nor for ease, but for endurance, that their hearts might stay strong and that the warmth might stay within their circle. The fire was their mediator, their bridge to the unseen. Sometimes they placed bits of dried sage or sweet grass into the coals, and the smoke that rose from it was said to carry their thoughts upward, twisting and shimmering like invisible threads between worlds. The air filled with that sharp, sweet scent, and even the children fell silent, watching the smoke rise and disappear through the opening at the top of the tipi. The snow itself had a spirit too, not cruel, only demanding. To survive it was to respect it. Elders told stories of times when those who mocked the cold or wasted their fire found their tents buried or their warmth stolen in the night. These were not superstitions born of fear, but lessons carved from experience. To live in balance with nature, you had to listen. The fire, the snow, the wind, all of them spoke, if you knew how to hear. Some believed that during the deepest nights of winter, when the stars burned sharp and close, the spirits of the ancestors walked with the storm. They moved between the tipis, unseen but felt, watching to see who tended their flames well, who honoured the cold with patience, and who cursed it with anger, and those who showed respect, who sat quietly and fed their fires through the long hours, were said to wake to calmer skies, to a sense of peace that could not be explained. It was not religion in the way we might name it today. It was relationship. Fire and snow, light and dark, warmth and cold, all part of one long conversation between humans and the earth. When you live in a world where the sky can kill you, faith becomes something practical, woven into the way you breathe, the way you build, the way you sleep. And so, long after the cold had retreated and the rivers ran clear again, the people still tended their fires with the same care as they had in the hardest nights, because the lesson of winter was not only how to survive it, but how to remember it, how to keep the spirit of warmth alive even when the world outside no longer required it. When the darkness settled again over the plains and the first warm season stretched deep into summer, the people turned their faces upward. The same sky that had watched them through the storms now glittered with uncountable lights, clear and sharp as the edge of flint. No smoke from cities, no hum of machines, only the slow breathing of the earth and the heartbeat of the stars. Each night the fire flickered below, and the constellations shimmered above, mirrors of one another. The people used to say that the flames were the stars of the earth and the stars were the fires of the sky. Children would lie on their backs beside the dying coals, eyes wide, watching how the sparks rose and vanished into the dark. Elders sat near them, pointing with slow, steady hands to the patterns traced above, the shape of the great buffalo, the trail of the hunters, the long curve of the spirit river that flowed from horizon to horizon. Each constellation was a story, and every story a memory. When they spoke of the great buffalo, they remembered the herds that had once thundered across these same plains, and when they named the hunter, they told of patience, of endurance, of the balance between courage and restraint. The stars were maps too, not drawn on hide or bark, but carried inside the mind. Travelers could find their way by the rising of the morning star or the tilt of the dancer's belt. When the world turned white with snow and the ground gave no clue of direction, the sky remained constant, the only compass that never froze. The people read it the way others might read words on a page, tracing the shifting lines from night to night, remembering which ones led toward the mountains, which ones toward the plains. Yet the stars were not only tools, they were kin. It was believed that every person had a star of their own, glowing quietly somewhere above, watching their path through life. When someone was born, the elders would sometimes step outside and scan the heavens, trying to guess which new light had begun to shine. And when someone died, they would sit by the fire and look for a flicker where there had been none before. The heavens were not distant, they were a living camp above the world, a reflection of their own. On calm nights, when the wind rested and the sky was clear enough to show the faint shimmer of the Milky Way, the people said that was the smoke of the great campfire, where all the ancestors gathered. It was the same fire to which their prayers of winter had risen, the same warmth they carried from ember to ember through the cold. Some said that when a spark jumped from their fire into the night, it joined that great smoke above, carrying a fragment of their life upward so the spirits could remember them. As the elders spoke, their voices were slow, steady, full of pauses that let the night itself answer. Sometimes a coyote called from far away, and the children turned their heads. Sometimes a breeze passed through the hides, stirring the embers into soft glow. The stories weren't meant to entertain, they were meant to anchor, to remind everyone that their small fires below were part of a much larger pattern, one that stretched beyond time. And so, under the vast dome of stars, they learned that warmth did not only come from flame, but from belonging, the knowledge that they were not alone in the darkness, that above them burned same fires tended by their ancestors, and below them glowed the coals that would light the path for their children. The first sign that the seasons had turned again was not seen but felt, a subtle shift in the wind, colder around the edges, carrying with it the faint smell of dry grass and distant smoke. The earth's warmth began to pull inward, retreating like breath before sleep. The people noticed it in small things, the horses growing restless at dusk, the dogs curling tighter at night, the way the sky lost its blue and deepened into silver. Soon the fire became the center of every evening again, and the stories, those old companions, returned to fill the spaces between the crackling logs. By late autumn the nights grew longer, stretching like shadows across the plains. The air turned sharp enough to bite, and the moon rose pale and large over the camps. Each tipi glowed faintly from within, small golden hearts beating in the darkness. The people began their preparations, quiet, methodical, as they had done countless times before. Hides were inspected for wear, poles mended, sinew ropes retwisted, supplies of meat and fat hung high on drying racks. The rhythm of survival returned, not frantic but assured, practiced, almost ceremonial. Children ran between the tippers gathering fallen twigs for kindling, their laughter turning to mist in the cold air. Mothers lined the inside walls with fresh furs, sealing every seam against the wind. Men brought stones closer to the fire to warm them for the night, the same simple gesture repeated for generations. And above them all, the northern sky shimmered faintly, the stars already sharpening their light as if preparing for the cold. But autumn was not only about work, it was the season of memory. Around the fire, the elders spoke again of the last winter, how the snow had piled high against the hides, how the wolves had sung closer to camp than usual, how one family's fire had burned bright enough to guide hunters home through a blizzard. The children listened wide-eyed, the flickering light painting shifting shapes on their faces. They did not yet know fear. They were learning reverence. The old ones did not tell these stories to frighten, but to remind, to prepare their hearts as well as their hands. Sometimes during the calm evenings before the true cold arrived, the whole camp would grow still. You could hear the wind combing through the tall grass, the faint rustle of hide as a tipi settled against its poles, the soft pop of sap bursting inside a burning log. The people called it the talking of the fire, and it was said that if you listened closely enough, you could hear the spirits whisper through the flames, voices of those who had survived winters long ago, teaching once more how to endure the one to come. Even the animals seemed to understand the turning of the year. Horses huddled close to the shelters, their breath thick in the chill air. Dogs buried themselves in the bedding near the doorways. Ravens circled above the camp, black against the pale sky, their calls echoing like omens of frost. Yet none of it was met with dread. The cold was not an invader. It was a returning guest, and the people welcomed it with quiet respect. And so the evenings deepened. The stars came earlier, the fires burned longer, and each night ended the same way, with someone stirring the embers, covering them gently with ash, whispering a small prayer to keep the warmth alive until morning. They knew that soon the wind would rise again, that snow would find the seams in the hides, that the long season of endurance was near, but they were ready. They always were. Because for these people, the cycle of seasons was not a battle to win, but a promise to keep, a covenant between warmth and cold, fire and snow, earth and sky. And as the last leaves fell and the plains turned white once more, they carried within them the quiet certainty that life, like flame, can bend but never break. The snow began falling before sunset, thin and uncertain at first, like a whisper testing the air. The boy stood just outside the circle of the camp, watching the flakes drift down onto his open palms. They melted instantly, leaving tiny beads of water that caught the dimming light. He had seen snow before, from a distance, from the safety of his mother's arms. But this was different. Tonight he was old enough to sleep on his own side of the fire, to take his place among the others, no longer a bundle tucked beneath robes, but a watcher of the flames. As the light faded, the camp quieted. Dogs curled in the snow near the entrances, their breath puffing in rhythm with the wind. The elders moved more slowly now, their shadows long against the glowing hides. Inside the tipi, the fire breathed low and steady, its smoke winding upward toward the night. The boy sat cross-legged on a folded robe, feeling the cold seep through the soles of his moccasins. And for a moment he thought of the vast emptiness outside, the wind, the snow, the dark. It seemed endless, and he felt very small. His grandmother noticed. She leaned forward, her face lit by the soft glow of the fire, her eyes bright and calm. She didn't ask what frightened him. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for a long stick, drew it through the coals until the tip glowed red, and held it between them. "This," she said softly, "is the heart of the world. It burns because everything that lives gives a little of itself to keep it alive. You must never be afraid of the cold, only forgetful of the fire." The boy watched the ember, mesmerized, the glow reflected in his wide eyes, trembling slightly as if alive. She placed the stick gently back among the logs, and sparks jumped upward, swirling like tiny stars. Each one, she whispered, goes home to the sky, and one day when you are far away and see your breath turn to mist, remember that is your own fire speaking back to you. He nodded, though he didn't fully understand. The wind pushed against the walls, making the hides shudder like sails on a stormy sea. But the fire held steady, and the circle of warmth around him felt stronger now, like a heartbeat he could feel through the floor. His grandmother hummed softly, a tune that rose and fell like the wind outside. It wasn't a song with words, just a sound to keep the dark at bay. The boy leaned closer to the fire, eyes heavy, and thought he could hear voices in the crackle, distant, kind, familiar. Maybe the spirits his grandmother spoke of. Maybe the wind itself learning to speak softly for once. Outside, snow continued to fall, thicker now, cloaking the camp in silence. The world narrowed to the small circle of light that pulsed within their tipi, a golden heartbeat in an ocean of white. The boy's head drooped, his breathing slowed. His grandmother smiled, pulling a robe of buffalo hide over him, tucking it close beneath his chin. The fur was warm, smelling faintly of smoke and earth. She watched him for a long time, the way only elders do, seeing not just the child but the man he would become. When she finally lay down beside him, the fire still burned softly, its glow painting the walls with moving shapes that looked almost like dreams. The wind pressed and howled but could not enter. The snow piled high against the outer hides, sealing them in a hush that felt holy. And somewhere beyond the camp, across the plains and the darkness, the same snow fell on other fires, other families, other stories. The boy slept deeply that night, his small hand resting near the warmth, his face peaceful. When he dreamed, he saw a great field of stars stretching endlessly above, and from each star a thread of light reached downward, not cold, not distant, but alive, like the fire inside the tipi. He reached out in his sleep and touched it, and the cold turned gentle, the wind turned kind. By morning, when he awoke, the fire had burned down to coals and the world outside was white and still, but he no longer feared it. He smiled, stretching beneath the robe, and whispered the words his grandmother had said, a secret now his own. Never fear the cold, only forget the fire. Years passed like seasons folding over themselves. The boy grew tall and silent, his shoulders hardened by the wind, his hands steady as stone. He learned the paths of the herds, the moods of the rivers, the hidden language of the sky, and yet in every winter that followed, when the cold returned and the world turned white again, he carried within him that one memory, a soft voice beside the fire, and the glow of a coal that seemed to breathe like a living thing. On the coldest night of his 20th winter, he found himself far from camp. The hunt had gone long, the herd scattered, and the sun had already fallen behind the ridge before he realized how quickly the temperature had dropped. His horse snorted, breath turning to steam that froze mid-air, the reins stiff with frost, the horizon blurred into nothingness. No trail, no shape, only wind and darkness. He knew what that meant. A whiteout was coming. He dismounted, his hands trembling from the cold that crept beneath the layers of fur. Snowflakes stung his face, sharp as sand. For a moment, fear tried to rise, that old instinctive panic that comes when the world vanishes around you. But then he heard it, faint and far, a whisper that wasn't quite the wind. Never fear the cold, only forget the fire. He remembered. Moving quickly now, he dug into the snow with his hands until he reached frozen earth. His breath came in heavy clouds, his muscles burned. He cleared a shallow pit, lined it with bark, stripped from a fallen tree, his fingers numb but precise. Then he reached into the small pouch he always carried close to his chest, a pouch his grandmother had given him years ago. Inside it, wrapped in hide and ash, was a single ember, carried from the last camp's fire. He had never needed it until now. He opened it carefully, breath held, and there it was, a faint glow, like a sleeping heart. He whispered to it, as she once had, a breath, a spark, a flicker, then light. The fire caught slowly, reluctantly, but it lived. The flames rose in thin fingers, painting gold on the snow, turning the dark back into a place with edges again. The cold receded, but not all at once. It lingered like an old ghost at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. The young hunter sat beside the flames, wrapping his robe tighter, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. Hours passed, maybe more. The storm came in waves, the wind howling and circling, but he did not move. The fire hissed and whispered, its voice soft and steady. At times it seemed to breathe with him, the flames bending when he exhaled, rising when he inhaled, as if it remembered who he was. He fed it small pieces of wood, careful, deliberate. The snow piled high around him, forming a wall, not a trap, but a shield. Within that hollow he was alone, but not afraid. Through the shifting light, he thought of his grandmother again. Her lined face, her calm eyes, the way her voice could make even the fiercest storm feel small. He realized that every winter since that first night had been preparing him for this one, teaching him that warmth is not something you find, but something you keep alive, that the fire outside and the fire within are one and the same, and if either dies, the other follows. When the storm finally broke, the air fell still. The snow glittered under the pale light of a new moon. The hunter rose slowly, stiff from the cold but alive. His fire still burned, steady, defiant, a small star against the frozen plain. He looked at it for a long time, knowing that somewhere above the stars were watching, their light older than any winter, their silence full of memory. He took a coal from the edge of the fire, buried it carefully in ash, and placed it back in the pouch at his chest. Then he turned his horse toward the horizon, toward the faint line of smoke where his people waited. Behind him the flames flickered one last time and then dimmed, their smoke rising into the vast, indifferent sky, carrying his breath, his fear, and his faith upward, where the ancestors burned eternal. By the time he saw the smoke from the village, the sun was already climbing pale and slow above the horizon, casting long golden fingers across the snow. His horse's breath drifted in heavy clouds, and each exhale felt like gratitude. The air still bit at his face, but it was no longer cruel, only sharp enough to remind him that he was alive. The line of Tippis appeared through the haze one by one, their hides shining faintly with frost, smoke curling from their tops like ribbons of silver. The smell of burning wood reached him before the voices did, the smell of home warm and honest and old. As he approached, dogs barked softly, circling his horse, their tails stiff with ice. Children peeked out from behind the hides, eyes wide with curiosity. The elders stepped forward slowly, their robes thick, their faces unreadable at first. The young hunter dismounted, his knees weak but steady. He said nothing. He only knelt and opened the small pouch at his chest. Inside, nestled in grey ash, a single coal still glowed faintly red. A hush fell over the camp. The eldest woman, his grandmother's sister, leaned forward, eyes glinting like wet stone. She understood before anyone spoke. With trembling hands, she took the coal, placed it in the center of a shallow pit, and covered it gently with dried grass. When the fire caught, it rose with a soft, familiar sigh, the same sound every flame makes when it recognizes home. The people stood around it in silence, their faces bathed in light. Some smiled, some wept, but no one spoke for a long while. It wasn't just a flame, it was proof that the world had held him, that the lessons had not been forgotten. The young hunter watched the fire dance and realized that this moment was the true meaning of warmth, not the heat on his skin, but the life that passes from one generation to another, unbroken, alive. That night, the camp was filled with light. Every tipi had its own glow. Every fire fed from the same coal he had carried through the storm. The air smelled of cedar and smoke, and laughter rose again, cautious at first, then full and free. Old songs were sung, not of victory but of endurance, of returning, of remembering. The flames flickered on the hides, painting moving shapes of ancestors and animals, rivers and winds, the same old stories retold in light. Later, as the people drifted to sleep, the young hunter sat alone by the main fire. He held his hands close to it, feeling the same warmth that had once wrapped him as a child beside his grandmother. The wind moved softly outside, brushing the hides like a gentle hand. He looked upward, to the dark sky full of stars, and for a moment he thought he could see her there, her eyes bright as embers, her voice in the whisper of the flames. He smiled, feeding the fire one last stick, watching the sparks leap upward and vanish into the night. Somewhere out there, he knew. The cold was already gathering again, waiting for another season, another test. But for now, the world was calm, and the circle was unbroken. The same ember that had once been lit by his grandmother's hands now burned in his, a flame that would one day be carried forward by another, into another winter, another story. And so the fire lived on. The years moved like slow wind across the plains, unseen, steady, patient. The young hunter grew into a man, and the man into an elder, his face lined by sun and frost, his hair gone white as the snows that had shaped his life. He had watched many winters rise and fade, many storms come and pass. Each one left a mark, a small scar on the heart, a memory in the smoke. Yet through it all, the fire never left his side. By now he no longer hunted far. His sons and grandsons walked the long trails, following the herds across the frozen rivers. He stayed close to the village, tending the fires, teaching the children what he once learned from his grandmother, that warmth is not given. It is earned, not just through flame, but through patience, care, and faith. In the quiet evenings when the sun sank low and the wind carried the faint cry of wolves from the ridge, he would sit by the central fire and let the little ones gather around. Their faces glowed orange in the light, eyes wide, hands clasped together to feel the heat. The old man would speak softly, not as a teacher but as one who remembers. He told them of the first cold night when he was their age and feared the dark. He told them of the blizzard that nearly swallowed him, and the ember that saved his life. He spoke of the voice of his grandmother, of the whisper that said, "Never fear the cold, only forget the fire." The children leaned closer, their breath mixing with the smoke, their hearts beating fast as though the storm itself were still outside, listening. And when he finished, he would reach for a stick, stir the coals and say, "This fire is the same one I carried through the snow. It is the same that burned in her tipi, and the same that burns in yours now. When I am gone, you must remember to carry it too, even if only here." And he would tap his chest, slow and gentle. The fire inside must never go out. Sometimes, as he spoke, the fire would pop and spark, sending tiny embers drifting upward. The children would watch them disappear through the smoke hole and whisper that those were spirits, the souls of ancestors joining the stars. The old man would smile and nod, saying nothing. He didn't need to explain. He had seen enough winters to know that everything returns, the snow, the wind, the cold, even the light. As the seasons passed, the people began to speak of him not just as a hunter or elder, but as the keeper of the fire. When someone's hearth went cold, or a storm blew out their flame, they would come to his tipi, bringing a bowl or a bundle of bark. He would smile, reach into the coals, and gift them a spark, and each time he did, he whispered the same words under his breath, a prayer as old as the smoke itself. The winters grew softer as the years wore on, or perhaps it was only that the people had learned to endure them better. The old hunter would sometimes sit outside, wrapped in furs, watching the snow fall. The sky above him seemed larger now, the stars closer. He felt no fear of the cold, only gratitude. The same cold that had once tested him now soothed him, reminding him of everything that had kept him alive. One night, when the moon was full and the plains shone silver, he sat alone beside the fire, the camp asleep around him. The air was perfectly still. He reached out, placed a log on the flames, and watched as the smoke rose straight into the sky. "It is your turn now," he murmured, his voice barely more than breath. "Keep it burning." And as the fire crackled softly, he closed his eyes. His face was calm, lit by the glow he had guarded all his life. By morning the embers still glowed in the pit, warm, alive, waiting. His sons found him there, his hand resting on his chest, a faint smile still on his lips. They did not weep right away. They simply tended the fire, as he had taught them. When night fell again, the flames rose high, carrying with them the smoke of farewell, drifting up to join the stars that flickered above the silent plain. One of the children looked up and whispered, "He's there now, keeping the big fire," and the elders nodded, for they too had seen the sky glowing brighter than before. And so the fire lived on. Many winters passed after the old hunter's last night, And though his name faded with the seasons, his story did not. The people carried it with them the way they carried fire, from camp to camp, from one generation's hands to the next. Long after his tipi had fallen, long after the poles had rotted back into the earth, the memory of his fire still burned, quiet and steady, in every home that dared the cold. When the snows came early and the wind turned cruel, the elders would gather the children close around the hearth. The flames would flicker on their faces, and someone would begin. There was once a boy who feared the cold. The little ones would draw nearer, pulling the hides to their chins, and the story would unfold again, of the ember carried through the storm, of the whisper in the dark, of the lesson that no one must ever forget. Each retelling changed slightly, as all living things do, but the heart of it remained the same. Sometimes the hunter was a boy, sometimes a woman, sometimes a spirit born from smoke itself. In some versions he wandered the plains forever, lighting fires for travelers lost in blizzards. In others he became a star, the red one that hung low above the horizon in the deep of winter. But always the fire lived, and the voice that said, "Never fear the cold. Only forget the fire," echoed through the centuries like breath against glass. Even when the world changed, when horses gave way to iron, when the great plains trembled beneath the hum of wires and the glow of distant cities, some still remembered. In lonely cabins and quiet camps, people would light their fires at dusk and pause for a moment before speaking, offering a small nod to the unseen, a gesture so small it could be mistaken for habit. But it wasn't. It was gratitude, the kind that doesn't need words. And sometimes on the coldest nights, travellers crossing the empty fields swore they saw a faint glow far off in the snow, a small circle of light where no settlement should be. They said that if you followed it, you'd find an old man sitting by the flames, eyes bright, a robe of smoke around his shoulders. He'd say nothing, only gesture for you to sit, and when you did, you'd feel warmth spread through your bones, deeper than any fire should give. Then, when you looked up again, he'd be gone, only the coals left, still glowing, waiting for your hands to tend them. The people called him the Keeper, and they said he walked wherever the wind was sharpest, wherever hearts grew tired, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that the flame which keeps you alive is the same one you must protect in others. By then, no one knew how long the story had been told. The language changed, the songs softened, the world turned restless. But every winter, when the first snow fell and the fields turned white again, someone would whisper the same words beside the first new fire. Remember the ember. Remember the hands that carried it. Remember the warmth that waits within the cold. And in that moment, in the hush between the crackle of flame and the sigh of wind, the old hunter's fire lived again. The city was silent that night, the kind of silence that comes only when the power goes out. Snow had been falling for hours, burying the streets, thickening the air, muffling every sound until even the hum of the world itself seemed to fade away. In a small apartment on the edge of town, a child sat by the window, watching the flakes drift past the dim orange glow of a candle. The lights had gone out hours ago, the heat with them. The radiators were cold, the windows trembling softly under the push of the wind. The boy's breath fogged the glass. His mother moved quietly behind him, wrapping another blanket over his shoulders, whispering, "It won't be long. The power will come back soon." But she didn't sound certain. He nodded anyway. Outside, the city was dark, a forest of frozen towers, a million windows black and still. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. He turned toward the little candle, its flame thin but steady. The wax had melted down the side in rivers that looked like ice. He watched it flicker, leaning closer, seeing how it bent when he breathed. The world felt endless, cold, far too big, and he felt very small. Then his mother, searching through a drawer, found something. A tin box she had forgotten she owned. Inside were matches, a few pieces of old wood, and a small carved object, dark, polished, warm to the touch. It was shaped like a coal, rounded smooth by years of fingers. "My grandfather gave me this," she said softly, turning it in the candlelight. He said it was lucky, said it was from a fire that never died. The boy stared at it. The carving shimmered faintly red in the glow, as though something deep inside it still remembered heat. From a real fire? He asked. She smiled, her eyes reflecting the flame. A story fire, she said, but that sip's just as real. Together they gathered what little wood they had, a broken chair leg, some old paper, a handful of twigs she'd kept from a summer trip. In the old metal bowl she placed the carving, whispered something the boy didn't quite catch, then struck a match. The flame rose small and uncertain, then caught, flickering in slow, steady breaths. The room filled with light, soft and golden. The air crackled gently. The shadows danced along the walls, alive again. The boy held his hands close, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers, his chest. The sound of the fire was different from the heater he had always known, slower, alive, full of presence. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. His mother smiled. An old phrase. "My father said it came from far away, from people who lived before roads, before cities," he said. "Never fear the cold, only forget the fire. Seps." The boy repeated it under his breath, testing the words like something ancient. They fit perfectly. He watched the flame grow taller, steadier, the wax from the candle now feeding the new fire. Outside, the snow kept falling, but the cold no longer frightened him. He could almost hear whispers in the crackle, not voices he knew, but something older, gentle, welcoming. And somewhere, far beyond the city, beyond the hills and the endless snow, the wind carried a faint scent of smoke, the same scent that had drifted across the plains long ago, the same warmth that had glowed in the center of a tipi beneath a frozen sky. The story had found its way home again. By morning, the storm had passed. The city lay buried beneath a pale, quiet sky, streets muffled beneath white drifts, rooftops softened into gentle slopes. But inside that small apartment, the fire still burned, low, steady, breathing softly in the metal bowl. Its light flickered against the walls, chasing away the blue shadows of dawn. The boy sat close, his hands cupped around the warmth, his eyes half closed, the whisper of his mother's words still circling in his mind. Never fear the cold, only forget the fire. He didn't know where the words came from, not really, only that they felt right. They felt old, like they had been spoken by many mouths before his, carried across mountains, plains, and centuries. Outside, the world was changing again, power returning, machines humming back to life, the pulse of modernity reawakening. But for a few lingering moments, none of it mattered. There was only the soft hiss of flame, the slow drift of smoke, the quiet heartbeat of warmth against skin. He looked toward the small carved coal, now resting black and still beside the last ember. He reached out, touched it gently, and felt, or thought he felt, the faintest warmth there, like the memory of a breath. He smiled, not questioning. Some things you don't need to understand. You only need to keep. Later that day, when the lights returned and the heaters clicked on, he didn't put the carving back in the drawer. He placed it by the window instead, where the sun could touch it. And each night after that, as the city fell silent again, he'd glance toward it before sleep, a small, dark stone glinting faintly in the light, as if still alive. Years would pass, and he would grow older, tell his own children the story. Perhaps he'd forget some of the details, change the words a little, make them his own, but he would always end it the same way, just as it had always been ended. Never fear the cold, only forget the fire. And somewhere, in the memory of the wind, in the whisper of the stars, in the hush between snow and smoke, that first fire still burned, the one the hunter carried through the storm, the one his grandmother once fed with her breath, the one that lived inside every heartbeat that refused to give in to the dark. Because the truth, as old as the plains themselves, was never about warmth or shelter. It was about remembrance. about keeping alive the small, quiet flame that says, I am still here, I will still burn. And so, even now, when winter returns and the wind begins to howl across the frozen land, somewhere out there, perhaps in a tipi, perhaps in a cabin, perhaps in a city window glowing against the dark, a single ember stirs, sighs, and remembers. The fire never truly dies. It only waits for someone to remember it.